All right, so let's try it. Let's see what happens. This is way too much stuff for my brain. So we'll try to keep it simple-ish.
Okay.
All right. All right, welcome back to The Empire Never Ended with Boris and Fritz and Ray.
Yo.
Hey.
We're finishing off the kind of trilogy of episodes here based on Christopher Simpson's book, Blowback, from the late 80s. And I don't know, stretching out even a little farther today. Getting some other sources in there, too. But we are trying to wrap up this trilogy with some fucking Vatican shit. Ratlines. I'm going to kind of tie up the kind of Green Berets story I started in the last episode on Bloodstone, and a little bit of house cleaning on the Gellin group episode and stuff. Or no, rather house cleaning on the Bloodstone episode. But man, this one hurts. This one hurts the brain. I made charts. I got totally Glenn Beck here. And freaked out, started crying, drawing lines on a chalkboard, and
So the central theme of this episode are the Ratlines, right?
Yeah. It's kind of all right. This episode, much like the previous one, is divided up into two parts: the first one and the second one. But the first one in this case and the second one are not as related. So the first part we're going to look at Ratlines. The second part we're going to look at the kind of Green Beret side story, much shorter part. So the main thing is going to be Ratlines today. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know about you, but when I was reading about the Ratlines stuff, I started to highlight all the different Catholic priests and stuff that they mentioned, and archbishops and stuff like that. And then it just became too much because way too many of them were implicated in really heinous things that I just kind of gave up at a certain point.
Maybe if you highlight the ones that were not part of the Ratlines.
Yeah, that's what liberals do already.
Guys. Yeah.
I mean, that's already what they do.
Okay.
That's kind of all the Vatican does. Yeah. Actually, that's a pretty good way to start, in fact, because outside of, even inside of a lot of scholarly research, this stuff has this really kind of salacious veneer to it. It's really very conspiratorial, and you get books called the Unholy Trinity and stuff like that, and the Nazi Pope. And I mean, that's not unfair, really. I mean, look, you do this shit, this is what happens, But I mean, it is a really bunch of salacious conspiratorial shit with Nazis and popes and all that. But I'm gonna try and not play it that kind of Dan Brown style that a lot of people, especially podcasts, treat this stuff with. So I'm not searching the Louvre for clues about secret Vatican gas chambers or anything here,
I mean, the great mystery here, I guess, is that they're all just a bunch of fascists, no?
Yeah, it's not that complicated. I mean, if that, yes. Not everybody in the Vatican. I mean, it's more about kind of cowardly reactionary survivalism that didn't really give a shit whether or not people were fascist or not. And added with support from the US, you end up with Nazis kind of running things. So yeah, but really despite the color of the story, the sort of psychedelic color of all these characters, it does kind of come down in a lot of ways to just trying to keep your rule over your stupid institution intact as the political landscape changes really rapidly. And that goes as much for the Vatican as it does for the psychos and the CIA and stuff. And that's why we need to start with the Intermarium.
Oh shit! All right.
Yeah. I'm not going to go into the full long history of this. We're not going into the Polish monarchy and stuff. We're going to kind of start in the more contemporary period with this. But in Simpson's book, which is based on U.S. intelligence reports. So it's also kind of the view of U.S. intelligence at the time. The Intermarium was seen then as essentially a Catholic organization that grew up in the Vatican in the 30s as an underground and anti-communist organization with strong fascist sympathies and like Nazi leadership and members and stuff like that. And that's all pretty much true as far as the Vatican is concerned. But the Intermarium idea predates the Vatican's little gang, although they will be central to the story here.
So there is an actual Intermarium organization that existed, not only some concept, geopolitical concept or something like that.
It was like a self-appointed council as far as the Vatican's element was concerned. But nowadays, if you look up Intermarium, you'll find it in like kind of more boring, standard, conservative Eastern European poli-sci nerdery kind of stuff. But we'll talk a little bit about that soon. But Intermarium means between the seas being the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic. It was a concept that came out of Poland, at least in its modern form. It came out of Poland in the interwar period after the First World War, kind of at the end of the First World War, although it actually has predecessors. The original idea was to act as a bulwark against both Russian imperial ambitions coming from the east and German ambitions coming from the west, and the kind of the predecessors to what would become the modern Intermarium kind of saw it as a sort of Eastern European Union in a way. And that element will stay throughout Intermarium's history. But here, following the First World War, the idea was, okay, we're going to support a bunch of little nationalist groups, maybe even some socialist groups. It doesn't matter that much, provided that those groups are destabilizing regimes in Germany and especially in Russia.
So wait, when you say we are going to support, you mean the Catholic Church, or who are we talking about?
This would be the people around Josef, oh God, how do you say his fucking name? Piłsudski.
Yes. It's got that stupid Polish L with the line through it.
Yes.
The W.
He, during the First World War, led the combat organization of the Polish Socialist Party, becoming the head of state during the Polish-Soviet War. And Piłsudski proposed, following that, the United Union that I mentioned of those countries between the Baltic, Adriatic, and Black Seas, who can pool their military resources and maintain kind of a collective independence from both East and West as they saw it. So at that point, that's when it becomes like an idea with like teeth. It moves from being sort of a sort of a dream of a future polity to an actual program that someone's trying to carry out. So this led to the creation of what was called the Promethean League, and this was among the Petlura-dominated Ukrainian Democratic Republic in exile. And this Promethean League was a semi-clandestine kind of destabilizing effort in Soviet territory run through the Polish military, sort of anticipating the Gehlen organization in a lot of ways.
So what decade are we talking about now?
This is 30s.
Okay.
Yeah. So they were kind of early to that kind of game, I would say, in the story. In fact, the opposition to this like Petlura Polish alliance is one of the things that would eventually give rise to the OUN in Ukraine. It wasn't like, you wouldn't call it fascist. You wouldn't even call it that strongly anti-communist. It grew there. Like at this time now, it will quickly become that. But even today, the main thing is territory. Like it's almost non-ideological, but it has a lot of room
Except
for
nationalism,
people like fascists.
Right?
It's an international nationalism. Yeah, exactly. It's nationalism. Yeah. That's why, for instance, now its most vocal proponent is Duda in Poland. Like they founded the Intermarium College a few years ago to be like a private think tank for Intermarium ideas and stuff like that. It's a big deal again. So anyway, it grew in the 1930s. This iteration of Intermarium with support from both British and French intelligence, who thought that this was pretty much perfect. Like basically they had at their disposal through this Polish military, this vast spy network, running destabilization ops both in Russia and in Germany. And the leadership of Intermarium, which at this point is both at the same time like a public call for a new political alliance in Europe, as well as at the same time a covert network of active agents. The leadership of this was pretty interesting. And this is from an article by Marlene Laruelle and Ellen Rivera. I'm just going to read it straight.
Mm-hmm.
The original members, according to Bill Gowan, were anti-German, anti-Habsburg elites who also opposed socialism and communism. Gowan named 3 prominent pre-war Intermarium leaders. Vlatko Maček, the Croatian Peasant Party leader and Yugoslav vice premier, Miha Krek, the Catholic Slovene People's Party leader and also Yugoslav vice premier, and Gregory, I believe this is Gavencu, Romanian foreign minister from 1938 to 41, and she writes, all 3 would become Western intelligence assets after the Second World War. And I looked it up, and Maček ended up in the U.S. in 46 on invitation from the State Department, which is pretty early, I must say, as far as like State Department buddies go. But I just kind of put that in there mostly because we know who Maček is, just to have like a nice touchstone. And do you guys want to say anything about? And we talked about him very recently, I think like 3 episodes ago or something.
So we talked about the Croatian Peasant Party a lot since our second arc, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, I think, in one of the episodes with Kemal. So the Croatian Peasant Party was the most important Croatian party in the 20s and 30s. It was the main kind of nationalist, autonomist party in Croatia, and also the central point of generally the opposition in the monarchist Yugoslavia. Yeah. Like its main ally was the party of Serbs from Croatia, and together these parties were known as the Peasant Democratic Coalition, and were the main opposition political organization in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And he really became the leader of the party after the first leader of the Croatian Peasant Party, Stjepan Radić, was assassinated in the parliament by a Serbian nationalist deputy, like a former Chetnik, a Chetnik who fought, in the Balkan Wars and before that in Macedonia as an irregular guerrilla guy. So, and then towards the end of the 30s, Maček was the vice president of the Yugoslav government and kind of broke this deal with the Serbian regime and created, just before the Second World War, this autonomous Banovina of Croatia inside Yugoslavia, which was like a sign that the Yugoslav monarchy was going into the direction of some kind of a federal system. You would have a autonomous Croatian unit inside of Yugoslavia.
Right.
And then World War II broke out.
Yeah. How opposed was he, though, to Germany in that time?
He wasn't. I mean, so he was definitely not a fascist. Like the Croatian Peasant Party has a interesting political history. At a time, they were even aligned in some way to the Soviet Union. So they were their party was a part of the International of peasant parties, which was organized by the Soviet Union. Yeah. Some of their members also went and fought in the Spanish Civil War. There was a detachment there, which was named after Stjepan Radić. But Maček, together with some Serbian politicians, was aligning Yugoslavia more with the Axis powers in the end of 1930s. So in a way that's the regime that the Yugoslavs got rid of in 1941 with the demonstrations and the coup d'etat of the 27th of March that we discussed also in one episode. So when that happened, that got rid of the regime of the Prince Paul, the regent, and the government in which Maček was the vice president, and triggered the Nazi invasion of Yugoslavia, because that's the government that signed the Tripartite Pact with the Axis powers.
And he joined the Yugoslav government in exile then?
He remained in, I think, the country, kind of in some interned position by the Axis powers. They offered him to be the Quisling, like Croatian puppet, head of some like the independent state of Croatia, but he declined this.
Right. Yeah.
And so I'm not too familiar with this. I didn't know we'll talk about it, but there was a division inside of the Croatian Peasant Party. So there was his like kind of deputy who was a member of the exile government in London, and was like even the vice president of the government, maybe even the president at some point. And there was like a kind of a left wing or right wing of the Croatian Peasant Party, and the left wing aligned itself with the partisan resistance movement and had like a prominent role in it. And the other part was aligned with the exile government. And I guess Maciek was in this weird position that he was kind of tolerated by the Axis powers, but also didn't want to play along with their plans.
That is actually what makes him a perfect leader of Intermarium right there. Because essentially apart from the members of Intermarium that we're going to talk about today who are straight up Ustasha, apart from those guys, like Intermarium generally has that exact kind of tactic. Like ideally neither Germany nor Russia, whatever, but push comes to shove, we're fine working with the fascists. And I think that's kind of how it plays out. But so I guess when you're thinking about Intermarium in general, don't think about them as they're often portrayed as like the ultra secret super Nazi sect in the Vatican. They had one that's real, but on a larger level, they kind of occupy this middle territory, sort of leaning towards fascist alliance and definitely leaning away from communism, even though occasionally they'll pick one up here or there, a socialist or something.
Right.
Yeah. But again, like the real meat of this story is about those fucking psychos, the actual Nazi Intermarium guys in the Vatican, especially one named Krunoslav Draganovic.
Oh, yeah.
We've mentioned him. I don't remember what all we've said about him, but I think he's come up a couple times.
We mentioned him. Yeah, he was the main organizer of the Ratlines, not only for like Ustasha, just for Nazis in general, from what I understand. You will tell us more about it.
Yeah.
What's interesting about him that at some point he returned to Yugoslavia.
Hey, that's a spoiler.
Yeah. Okay.
Although I think we mentioned that
we already mentioned
we
that.
did mention that. Yeah,
people did forget
you're right.
probably about it. Yeah.
We'll get there though. Draganovic is an interesting fellow, to put it mildly. So as Intermarium was settling into its sort of wartime configuration that I mentioned now, a group of supporters formed inside the Vatican led by Krunoslav. So Krunoslav Draganovic, like we said, is another Tenepod collectible bobblehead.
He's a Catholic priest, yeah.
His, I believe his doctoral dissertation formed the theoretical base to the Ustasha approach to the Serbs. He was also, I believe he was a priest at Jasenovac, which is nuts.
Yeah, and he had like a kind of deep connection family-wise too. His younger brother was the Ustasha, Krešimir Draganovic was the Ustasha ambassador to Berlin, or at least worked in the Croatian embassy in Berlin during the war. So kind of had even like a deep familial ties to the Ustasha state as well.
As far as I remember, his doctoral thesis was about how Croats of Bosnia and Herzegovina were at some point made to like convert to Orthodoxy. So I think for sure this influenced the Ustasha approach to the Serbian question. I don't think it was like a crucial thing in their ideology, but I guess he gave more arguments, to the thesis how Bosnia and Herzegovina are Croatian lands and how some Serbs there are actually of Croatian origin and so on. Like things that are important for nationalists, and they're
He was also in charge of relocation program of Serbs and Jews for a period of time inside Croatia.
Yeah, their Department of Colonization or whatever.
Yeah, Department of Colonization.
Internal colonization, yeah.
Yes. He was also tight with a guy named Pope Pius XII, who you might have heard of. He was also apparently tight with future Pope Paul VI.
Yeah, well, he worked at the Vatican,
and stayed there and was very happy there in Rome.
But wasn't he appointed to like a job during the Second World War at the Vatican? Wasn't he like a representative of the Ustasha government there or something like this?
Yeah, so in 1943, after the Italians capitulated in that kind of period of German takeover, he was sent to Rome to act as kind of the unofficial emissary of the like Ustasha state, kind of to be.
Right.
This is a role that he actually takes up a lot in his post-war life as being kind of Ante Pavelić's kind of legitimate face to the public.
Yeah.
Which was his role in Rome as well, including, it's something that's largely forgotten about now, but I mean, we talked about how much chaos there was within the Ustasha state.
It was mostly chaos.
It was mostly chaos, but by 43, it was pretty clear that like things weren't going the way they wanted.
Mm.
And so there are some, I read, I think it was in Uki Goni's book on the Ratlines, that actually the connection to Argentina that would be important later after the war, that Draganovic actually established during the war in order to get some Ustashas out of the country that were having like a political falling outs with the regime, or that were like becoming unfavored. And I think he kind of had this foresight of, this is, we'll establish a base there, essentially. I mean, because there were already lots of right-wing Croat emigres in Argentina already, but he established the connection with the Perón government even during the war. So like before it even ended.
Yeah, he's a guy who plans. He's a planner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
good at it.
Yeah, which is like a good illustration of that is that he died like a natural death in the 80s in Tito's Yugoslavia.
Yes. Yes. When he went to hell, there was a big sign printed out that said, "Well done.
Yeah.
You did it, buddy."
Hell? Come on.
I would hope. It's a Catholic episode.
Hmm.
Draganovic was the Croatian representative of the Intermarium Council, which I again said was like a self-appointed council. And it was divided up into different nationalities, and each one had a representative there in the council, all like Eastern European. And his connections there, combined with the Vatican's desire to rescue all fleeing Catholics from the Eastern Bloc, no matter who they were. The Vatican didn't care who was coming at all, as long as they were Catholic. And then very shortly after that mutated into, we don't care who's coming as long as they're anti-communist. And we all know what you get when you say that.
Right.
Nazis. So, yeah, but like you said, Draganovic was there very early. A lot of these guys were already part of these Ratlines that he built initially, that he would then expand and run through the 50s, which we'll talk about now.
And I mean, one of the crucial things that he also did, or was like really instrumental in doing while the war, like towards the war's end, was moving a large amount of money out of the Ustasha state, right? So, I mean, when you start looking at like where all the money goes, it's absolutely like crazy. Some of it even gets, a lot of it gets confiscated, but some of it ends up in very different places, right? So some of it obviously goes to Swiss banks, as you might expect. Some of it ends up in the Vatican.
Yes.
There, like a lot of it ends up in the Vatican.
Yes.
And for safekeeping, a lot of the times they were literally stashing it in like gold, kilos and kilos of gold inside of like Franciscan monasteries, both in Croatia and in Italy, especially in Italy, and all over the place. And then later in Argentina as well. So like there's some very important Ustashas that, established a fortune on, this plundered gold that Draganovic helped start moving out of the country before the war was even over.
Mm.
And that's what all these guys lived off of too. Because, there's, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this more in a minute, but like,
a fair stipend from certain intelligence agencies, depending on who they were. But,
yeah. Oh, because also then who had access to the gold became a big problem too. Some people just straight up stole it. Pavelić later in Buenos Aires had like his own way of distribution and caused some resentment with other Ustashas. And it gets pretty crazy. I mean, the whole stuff, the whole story with the gold is, an episode on its own, but it's very difficult to track. It does do what you just did for this episode, which is draw lots of lines emanating out of a central point,
Yeah. Yeah. And that was a really good link to our sponsor. Do you find that inflation is out of control? Secure your money today in gold with TENE gold bars.
Definitely not plundered from,
100% not plundered gold
Jasenovac.
Bars. Plan for your nuclear holocaust today. Okay, back to the episode. So, so from his base, Draganovic's base at the Croatian College of St. Jerome in Rome, Draganovic helped smuggle thousands of Ustasha and other fascists into Rome and then on to Argentina, etc., including, like we said, Ante Pavelic, who was received by the Pope and drove around with Vatican-issued papers and license plates and had a great time. Draganovic also helped bring over Klaus Barbie, the famous butcher of Lyon, and we're not going to get too much into that, but his relationship to the U.S. is pretty well known at this point, and his arrest and exposure were largely responsible for the declassification of the documents that allow researchers to piece together all of this that we're talking about today. Although a funny side note that I didn't know about Klaus Barbie is that at the time of his arrest, he had already kind of fallen out of favor with the CIA, but they couldn't really fire him without bringing attention to their little Nazi secret that was about to come out anyway. So they came up with this big brain fucking CIA plan to fire him, but not tell him that he was fired. And they would, to keep the ruse as realistic as possible, they would continue to receive reports from Barbie, continue to give him assignments, and continue to pay him.
Oh, okay.
That's the CIA people. Those are the big brains we're talking about here.
They were just embarrassed to have this conversation with him.
Yes. So guys, hear me out. What if we fire him, but he doesn't know he's fired? And then we just keep paying him and giving him stuff to do.
Maybe just to show what kind of a guy Krunoslav Draganovic was, is that besides, rescuing all of these Ustashas and Nazis like Klaus Barbie, he also apparently rescued a bunch of Serbian Chetniks, like collaborators from the Second World War as well. So,
I think they stayed at the same monastery. They had one monastery.
St. Jerome?
No, San Girolamo or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's him. Same guy.
Oh, that's St. Jerome. Okay. Yeah. So that's the one. Which is right, like next to Vatican City, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not quite in Vatican City, although a lot of Nazis also stayed in Vatican City.
So
including
a very weird
Ante
monastery,
Pavelic.
like bunch of Chetniks and Ustashas in it.
It's actually a college, and it's been responsible for educating hundreds and hundreds of Croatian priests to this day.
Yeah. And apparently, when all these guys were here and like a lot of important people were there, they straight up just had like armed Ustasha guards like patrolling the area. Nobody could get in or out. They were in like civilian uniform. Uki Guanyi describes this in his book pretty well, but you couldn't get in there without going through, armed guards who check your ID, and they had, visitors list, all that kind of stuff. So, it was a fucking Ustasha fortress in post-war Rome.
Yes. Not even post-war, though. That's the crazy thing. Like, he got there fucking early,
Yeah.
And that's also what I think is often underappreciated about the story, is that the Ratlines do precede CIA involvement, and they kind of stumble onto it. Actually, the CIC does, the Counterintelligence Corps does. So basically what happens is that this sort of infant U.S. deep state gets real close with the Holy See during the 1948 Italian elections, and the Vatican, using a $10 million fund of liquidated Jewish property that the U.S. had partitioned off for covert operations like this, helped put the Christian Democrats in power. And we're going to probably have to talk about all that in great detail someday, but today's not the day. But rest assured, the State Department's Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, that we talked about during the Bloodstone episode, were smattered with Intermarium people and anti-communist reactionaries shortly before the days of Bloodstone even. So about 350 million went into this total campaign, which today would be something like $4 billion. And the Vatican officials refused to bury or give communion to anyone who voted for communists. They had picked like a very clear side in here. And and also, they're getting that sweet Ustasha money also. So they've got a lot of things going for them here. So the Ratlines, much like the Intermarium organization, were also divided up into various ethnic relief kind of funds. Catholic ethnic relief, so Catholic Croatian Refugee Fund, etc. And each helped get their own nationalist, anti-communist, fascist friends out of harm's way. One of these guys, Ivan Buchko, also Intermarium, got Pius XII to personally intervene in the rescue of an entire 11,000-person Ukrainian Waffen SS division.
Jesus Christ,
A lot of those guys ended up in the U.S., the Vatican, and Canada. The
Canada,
Vatican rescued so many Nazis at this time that Pope Pius received a personal letter of gratitude from Otto Skorzeny thanking him for saving so many fucking Nazis. So you might ask, though, given that they supposedly have this kind of neither Germany nor Russia line, you know, how did Intermarium get so many Nazi friends, even outside of the Ustasha? Like, they were bringing Germans in as well. Well, I think it has to do with Abwehr, and Abwehr had built a wartime relationship with Intermarium as an extension of their own intelligence network. So it's sort of like, while Gelen had his thing going on, Abwehr had their thing going on, and it was linked through Intermarium members. And so this is like another network of like anti-communists and like Nazi collaborators that would go to the CIA eventually. But I think their relationship to Abwehr as opposed to like the SS is important in explaining how this network was built, because it was elements in Abwehr that kind of wanted to, I don't know what you would say, like, that were sort of opposed to certain elements of Hitler's sort of militant expansion, and they wanted to find peace agreements with the U.S., especially with Alan Dulles, who initially spearheaded this diplomatic effort between Roosevelt and like anti-Hitler elements in the Abwehr, unsuccessfully. Roosevelt told him to fuck off and die, and
yeah, we did mention like the Dulles was heading this what was called Operation Sunrise. Somewhere at the end of the Second World War, but he did do it, and I think the guy that he was negotiating with was an SS like general.
Well, that's Ralph. Yeah. But that was SS. These Abwehr guys didn't have success here. But the guy he did work with, Ralph, he was the inventor of the mobile gas van, and eventually ended up working for German intelligence well into like the 60s and 70s. So fun. Yeah, so again, like Intermarium's kind of anti-German stance is not so much anti-fascist as it is like anti-Germany in Eastern Europe. It's, however, like its anti-Soviet stance became very much anti-communist in a way that their like kind of anti-German expansion stance never really became anti-fascist, you know?
Well, like, for example, you know, one group that really kind of resisted Austria becoming, you know, part of the Reich were the Austro-fascists, for example.
Yes, exactly. It's these kinds of people. These like these anti-Hitler Nazis, basically.
Yeah.
These guys were kind of okay because they were willing to accept like the territorial integrity of whatever, Poland or something, whatever it would be at the time. So that's, I think, as far as I can tell, that's kind of how Intermarium ends up rescuing a bunch of like German Nazis as well as Eastern European ones, is kind of through these connections with Abwehr. So by 1947, Intermarium publications were already calling for Nazi amnesty overall, generally. They were saying that when the Intermarium is finally formed, it's going to need all of like the anti-communist troops it can get, you know, in this like multi-nation military effort to like stop the spread of the USSR or whatever. So this same bulletin that said like we need to give amnesty to Nazis went on to outline a very specific plan to break up the USSR into constituent ethnic states that exactly mirrored the plan of Rosenberg, the sort of Nazi philosopher and ideologue. And all of this Nazi smuggling and shitposting came to the attention of the CIC, the American Counterintelligence Corps, in 1947, and CIC agent Gowan. So Gowan had this like Hungarian fascist in his informant network. And that fascist one day just disappeared. And Gowan figured out that the Vatican had smuggled him out, and not just his informant, but like a shit ton of other Nazis that were already now living in South America. So far from being annoyed by this, Gowan sought out the Vatican's Intermarium agents and got a diplomatic visa for their Hungarian representative, a guy named Vojta Ferenc. Sometimes he's written as Vojda Ferenc. Vojta was an Aerocross propagandist, like a really prominent Jew baiter.
Aerocross is the Hungarian fascist party.
Yeah, exactly. And he ended up pulling together millions of dollars for kind of anti-communist covert ops after stripping Jewish Budapest of art and other like treasures from murdered Jewish houses and stuff like that in like the nicer parts of Budapest. And problematically, Vojta was arrested in Italy for these crimes, but with Vatican contacts, Agent Gowan got him out and got him to the U.S. as a CIC asset. But unfortunately for him, a reporter instantly got wind of all this and published it all in a huge article. And Vita had to run again, and this time ended up going to Colombia, where he worked as a Time magazine correspondent there until they found out that he was a Nazi, and then they fired him. So he went on to teach at this international university. I don't have the name for it, alongside some other CIA guys. I forgot to look that bit up, but he ended up, like most of these guys, retiring peacefully. But but it wasn't a great start, though, for this relationship between the CIC and the Ratlines. But Gowan's entrance into the Intermarium Council brought like a lot of other faces too, and these new connections helped him populate, or helped the State Department rather populate, like their airwaves of Radio Free Europe and Voice of America and stuff like that. And many of the people that kind of came from this relationship that Gowan was building between the CIC and the Vatican Ratlines also led to the Assembly of Captive European Nations, which is called ACAN. Probably most people our age don't know what that is, and certainly people younger than us don't, but like I bet you anything a lot of our boomer listeners remember this name. They were apparently everywhere for a while. You could find their publications at like garage sales for like decades anywhere you went in the US. And it included our old friend Hasan Dosti, Bali Kombetar guy from the Bloodstone episode, who launched that failed coup in Albania.
So it's basically an international alliance of various fascists who pose as like anti-communist Democrats or something like this.
Yeah, or even as governments in exile. I mean, that's really the line they're pitching, is that these are all like the true governments that are now awaiting an end of the communist occupation of their countries. That's it. And they became very important.
In some ways, like they were. I mean, like the Ustasha government in exile considered itself a government, and it had a pretty big, like, bank there to work on. And so they operated their own
leadership structure was intact.
Yeah, the leadership structure was largely intact. Most of the main guys made it out, to the extent that they had like an intelligence wing and like all this other stuff that states have or governments have. They had in Argentina and Spain. Yeah.
Although they were like barely had any kind of a functional state, even when they were not in exile.
Well, I think this is something that's interesting about them, because they were an emigre group to begin with, and I think they just really functioned a lot better when they were fucking emigres, and they're good at terrorism and stuff, but not good at much anything else.
Well, they were also good at pressuring Congress and some of the machinery of the U.S. government for a lot of the Cold War in the end. I'll talk about that kind of towards the end, but yeah. They ended up getting a lot of power. Initially, they were just a propaganda effort, but they ended up making pretty strong connections in U.S. government machinery. But again, like this episode is at least partially focused on Krunoslav, so let's get back to him. So Gowan's CIC straight up hires him to handle the escape of particularly like hot assets, Nazi assets, hotsies, to save a bunch of hotsies for them. And Draganovic already was heading like the most successful Nazi smuggling outfit ever.
Yes. I mean, the basis that he established, like the connections in the Argentine government, like he created a network that went beyond him eventually. Because eventually once the stuff was in place, then every other collaborator was able to kind of follow suit. Like, like the Slovaks or other groups that were, fleeing to South America in particular.
Yeah, and he wasn't also the only guy doing it, not even the only guy in the Vatican. I mean, like I said, like each kind of whatever nationality had their own guy there, apparently.
But from what I understand, a lot of that is a result of Draganovic's groundwork.
Yes.
Right. So some of the big, for example, Slovak collaborators that were highly sought after were brought it directly by, Draganovic in this typical fashion that he did, which was like, After Spain was eliminated as a route, it was like, he leads you literally to the boat in Genoa and puts you on a boat for fucking South America. And he did that with countless groups, like, hundreds of people.
Yeah. He did it for Andrija Artukovic as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who went to California, right?
Fucking psycho. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this was perfect for the CIC, who had been keeping fascists hidden in Austria at the time, and it wasn't a good look, and there was like increasing public scrutiny, And people were slowly becoming aware that, oh, hey, a lot of these Nazis seem to be still around and protected by the US. So Draganovic was kind of their salvation here with this problem. And he could get their favorite Nazis, like Klaus Barbie, to safety. And in return, Draganovic only asked that the CIC save some of like the harder to reach friends of his as well. So Draganovic would also point out people and the CIC would go pick them up. Also, Draganovic wanted money, and a lot of it, all the time. He loved money. He always had lots of money. So a report from Special Agent Robert Mudd from the time, whose name I love, Bob Mudd. Fucking awesome name.
Yes.
Perfect for like a fucking deep state bureaucrat, you know?
Yeah.
So Bob Mudd confirmed that scores of Ustasha were, at the time of his writing in like, what was this, 1950 maybe, were just straight up sitting in Draganovic's Franciscan monastery / college in Rome, or like living and running around freely in Vatican, and they were just fucking everywhere now. And then they would go somewhere, and then another 40 some of them would come in, you know? So Draganovic's enterprise continues well into the 1950s, like I said, as things, and this is a bit of an aside, but it's kind of important, as things begin to heat up in Korea. So while the U.S. is thinking about adding China to the list of places to nuke the shit out of, Christian Democrats in West Germany start putting pressure on the U.S. to stop, release all these Nazis from Landsberg prison, where they were saying that they were, being oppressed, like that kind of Yakian line. I wonder if this is where he got it from, but it's all about how the U.S. is oppressing these people, blah, 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 blah. And instead they should be like rehabilitated. So when Seoul fell to the communists in 1951, the High Commissioner for Germany, John McCloy, gives into this, and he decided to hang a few of the worst ones, like maybe 5 of them, as a symbolic measure, and then released all the other hundreds of them. And Christopher Simpson records the convicted war criminal and IG Farben executive, another Fritz, of course, Fritz Termir, saying this. This is what he said. Now that they have Korea on their hands, the Americans are a lot more friendly. Korea was a big deal. It helped out a lot with these Nazis. So this is around
people that we cite kind of sound the same.
Well, all the Fritzes that we cite?
Oh, mostly Germans, yeah.
They all
or
sound
mostly
like,
named Fritz, yeah.
They all sound like a effeminate Austrian fella.
Yeah, or like some like Indiana Jones Nazi.
Well, that's because that's who they are.
Yeah.
They are Indiana Jones Nazis.
Yes, they are, literally.
So, and this is also, by the way, around the same time that the labor service that we talked about in the last Bloodstone episode stops pretending that they're not hiring Nazis. They're just like, fuck it, we don't care anymore. That's not to say that the U.S. was outright saying, yeah, we support Nazis, deal with it. Of course, this whole thing is secret, and when I said like they stopped pretending that they're not hiring Nazis, they're pretending to each other. You know what I mean? Like it's one department saying to another department, hey, don't hire Nazis. And the other department being like, okay, we won't, wink, wink, And at a certain point, they just stop doing that. And they're just like, we need more Nazis. So the public face, though, is still very loudly anti-Nazi. And this was pretty great for Draganovic because now he had his hooks way in, right? They needed Nazis, but they also needed nobody to know about it. Right. So the CIC special agent Lyon, Lyon, Lon.
Let's call him
Lion. Special Agent Lion even recommended expanding support during this period to Draganovic. This is like 1951 because he offered them this really helpful cover that they needed. Draganovic was essentially, a private citizen who already created the network long before the CIA got there. He could smuggle anyone out that the U.S. wanted, while the U.S.'s hands remained pretty clean. And they also wanted Draganovic happy because if he jumped ship, this like facade would be in jeopardy. So an Agent Lion also had his own problems professionally at the office. So he wasn't getting along. This is now we're like early 50s, 51-ish. Mm-hmm. He wasn't getting along with Wisner's Office of Policy Coordination, which we also talked about in Bloodstone, especially this guy named Robert Bishop. Who was Wisner's man in Italy. And Wisner had worked with him in Bucharest before, and they did stupid shit there too. Lion thought that Bishop was a complete asshole, and he wrote this at one point. After a breakdown due to alcoholism, Bishop imagined himself as the savior of Italy. And he would say like, oh, he thought he was a big man in the intelligence scene. Like Lion really hates Bishop. So Bishop basically waltzes into Rome in 1948. to get in on that good election meddling business. And he tries to snatch Draganovic's network from Leon and Gowan's CIC. So the CIC liked Draganovic's Ratline just the way it was. It was relatively autonomous, it was very friendly, and it was very secretive, and that was good. And Bishop wanted to turn the whole thing instead into a guerrilla warfare network and just start fucking killing people. So that was like the CIC versus the CIA, like CIC, quiet, Nazis that we want, no hubbub. CIA, let's start nuking and get people up against the wall ASAP.
Yeah.
So
let's have some like disastrous guerrilla missions.
Yes, exactly. That's what it is. They wanted more disastrous guerrilla missions. So Lion's like, no, that would be a disastrous guerrilla mission, and we would lose our network completely. Like the one thing that this guy's doing right, you want to like fuck around with. So Bishop got mad that Lion wouldn't share his toys with him. So he went to his dad, Wisner, and told him to make Lion share his toys. Give him the lion's share, you might say.
Ooh.
So Bishop got to play with Draganovic in the end when the CIC's Ratline budget expired in 1951. It was just a fucking bureaucratic thing. The time was up. Bishop took it over completely from Lion, who was pretty upset about this, and Krunoslav Draganovic became a contract agent for the CIA. His network was now focused also on intelligence gathering and not just moving people around. So Draganovic's what he called Vatican refugee relief enterprise continued through the 1950s, funneling Ustasha around South America into the U.S., where many would eventually join Otpor, the Croatian movement, which I suppose we'll talk about pretty soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll talk about the Croatian emigre communist, Croatian emigre anti-communist
Very
groups.
much not communists. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Assassins, bombers, hijackers, not communists.
No.
Yeah. Draganovic was also simultaneously running currency smuggling, a ring of currency smuggling into Yugoslavia, I believe, was the direction there, with Yugoslav priests who got caught and tried and sentenced. Draganovic did none of those things. He just kept on moving. But at some point, the CIA began to doubt his usefulness, partially because of the smuggling ring. It was a bit too public, and partially because Draganovic had been supplying them uniquely shitty information about Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started to talk about somehow cutting him loose, which I guess to them means continuing to pay him, send him fake assignments, and receive his reports. But then suddenly, as in 1967, the Croatian press in the U.S. reported that Draganovic had been kidnapped and tortured and executed by Yugoslav intelligence, which, of course, as we said, was not the case. And we already kind of said the ending here, but I'm just going to let Christopher Simpson sum up what happened there and also his opinion about why. So, in reality, however, Draganovic returned to Yugoslavia voluntarily in 1967, then lived out the remainder of his days in Zagreb, the capital of the Croatian state inside the country. There was no trial for war crimes, no execution, and not even criticism or harassment in the Yugoslav press. He died peacefully in July 1983, all of which raises reasonable doubt about whether Monsignor Draganovic, war criminal, Ustashi smuggler, that's how people write it a lot, Ustashi, and career contract agent for the U.S. intelligence, might have been working for the Yugoslav Secret Service for quite some time prior to his return to his homeland.
Yeah.
I mean, that does seem kind of likely. I don't see any other way that would have happened, that they would have just let him come back like that.
And have him on like TV, apparently, talking about how great Yugoslavia is and all this. And
I don't know about TV. I read a text that he wrote to the Yugoslav secret police when he was brought back, where he talked about his history and views and so on. And he implied that he had a long conflict with Ante Pavelic, which basically started because Draganovic claimed to have been appalled by the genocide of Serbs and kind of protested against it to Pavelic and so on. That's what
when
he
was
wrote.
That? When he was working in Jasenovac, or
yeah, I guess, yeah.
Fuck that guy.
I mean, he was pretty explicit. I think it was in Simpson's book that quotes him about like when he was asked why he was smuggling all the Nazis.
Yeah.
And he said, we have to have a reserve to draw on in the future.
Yes.
I mean, this was like clearly his individual motivation to do stuff. Although I do think with a lot of this stuff, especially afterwards, that they do go crazy about the fucking money. Because there's like a whole other like side quest of another like big Ustasha priest who was Ivan Šadić, who was archbishop in Bosnia, who was a British intelligence asset, and apparently, along with this other like Slovenian bishop, had their hands on an extraordinary amount of gold, some of which disappeared to some British intelligence officers. So I think like there was these dudes all of a sudden had a shit ton of fucking money.
Yeah.
Yes.
And started losing their minds a little bit with it. I mean, Šadić, I think he died in Franco's Spain, but the other guy, the Slovenian guy whose name escapes me right now, like, you know, went to the U.S. Like I said, when you read some of these accounts of some of these individuals, like they set up successful businesses, they do all this stuff because imagine if you have like, you know, 100 kilos of like gold. I mean, and some of it's like grim too. It's exactly what you might expect, like, you know, suitcases full of, you know, people's watches and gold teeth and shit like that. You know, they had some good seed money for a new life. I think a lot of them took it and ran with it. Although, I mean, people like Šadić were some of the worst of like the Catholic, like Ustasha. I mean, like who were really like ideologues who like really, really. I think Šadić particularly hated Serbs like big time. It's just like. They called him the hangman of Sarajevo, I think. Like bad people, very bad people.
Yes, yeah. We'll talk about some of the numbers, at least in the U.S. In part 2 here, but we're gonna finish up part 1 now. You know, I mentioned like Otpor and that just briefly there, but like a lot of these guys that came through the Ratlines didn't get into like, let's say, radical violent politics. They instead got into pretty much everyday right-wing American politics, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And they ended up in like various emigre groups, and a very few of them, a very select elite, ended up in part 2 of this episode. But before that, I should say that the most important of these emigre associations was what I already mentioned, the CIA-backed Assembly of Captive European Nations, which was mostly a collection of like Bloodstone beneficiaries who styled themselves as governments in exile. But yeah, also a lot of these guys came up through the Ratlines too. So they kind of meet here in the States. And I mentioned that they included our old buddy Hassan Doti. But I didn't stress how central both the Ratlines and Bloodstone were to the formation of this thing, nor the influence that it managed. I just said that like they were influential. So here's an actual example, and it has to do with Yugoslavia. So one example of this influence was with S Yugoslav Relations. And again, I'm just going to quote Simpson at length here because I just got lazy. So here's from the book. George Kennan, who had returned to government in 1961 as U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia under President Kennedy, remembers how the same ethnic coalition succeeded in pressuring Congress to stop the extension of most favored nation trading status to Yugoslavia, and then in halting the shipment of obsolete jet fighter parts, for which the Yugoslavs had already paid. The CIA funded ACEN, that's the Assembly of Captive European Nations, role in banning the export of fighter parts is ironic because the agency had itself helped arrange the sale of the previous generation jets to the independent-minded Yugoslavs in the first place as a means of splitting that country away from Moscow. After the Americans' promises for spare parts had collapsed, Marshal Josip Tito of Yugoslavia went back to the USSR for his first reconciliation with the Soviets in 15 years. He was met at Moscow's airport with roses and marching bands. So that's kind of how I'm going to end part 1 here.
Okay.
But maybe we can just pause for a minute and reflect on just the wonders that are the Ratlines and the Intermarium. Just think about it for a minute. You don't have to say anything, you know. Let's just be together in this moment.
You know, I hadn't really thought too much about I didn't know too much about the Intermarium aspect of this.
Me neither. That's why this episode is late. There's a lot more to learn about it. It goes on and on and on.
Because, I mean, when it comes to, like, the Ratlines and all that, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting and kind of crazy stories regarding specific individual cases, right? And also about like how it looked in like the early days in the emigre communities when like big shots like Pavelic show up.
Yeah.
Which, we'll talk about in our Croatia section coming up.
Real soon.
Yeah. And then, of course, that like all these Catholic connections, of course, also helped certain Ustashas that weren't, let's say, totally damaged, as in like wanted by many, wanted by the Yugoslav government as like a, A-list war criminal, got positions in the Argentine state.
Yeah.
Joined like the Peronist party in order to find like employment for all the thousands of people that were coming, which included some like kind of funny things that like a lot of Ustasha emigres, the lower ranking ones, were like assigned in construction to some like pretty big landmarks, including Evita City, which is like a neighborhood designed in the shape of Evita Perón's profile. I guess that was largely built by Croatian laborers.
Such a dumb idea. That's like when you get like a back tattoo of someone's face, and over time it just gets shittier and shittier.
Yes.
Great.
Wasn't Pavelic himself some advisor to Perón or something like this? Is this true?
Yes, and maybe.
Well,
a lot of them were, but in some kind of varying official capacities.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just Argentina either.
Yeah.
Like some of them ended up in Chilean military intelligence. Some of them ended up in like the Brazilian army. Like they
Bolivia
had a large
was a big-
influence.
I think some ended up in Egypt. Yeah.
Oh yeah, we'll talk. That's a whole
Syria,
different thing.
too.
We'll talk about that. Yeah, that's because that's unrelated to these specific Ratlines, because those didn't go through the Catholic Church.
Yeah. But yeah. So that's part one, guys. So part two. Now, as I promised, this episode is also about the Green Berets, although it's not like super connected here. It's all connected. It's all connected. It's all connected. But it's not like directly connected to part one. As much as like, let's say like what we just talked about, like the fascisting of South America, the continued support by the US of Intermarium today, these kinds of things, these are largely the consequences of the fascist movement through the Vatican Ratlines. And also like as like far right Eastern European diaspora in the US and Canada are also kind of the result of like the CIA et al. Collaborating with these Intermarium chuds. So these are sort of the outcomes of these connections. The Green Berets are another outcome of this network, but they come from that relationship between the U.S. deep state and the fascist emigres that we laid out already in Bloodstone and Gellin episodes. Furthermore, the Green Berets' relationship to fascism helped, in the end, revitalize the U.S. militia movement, and also like these fascists at home, as well as others. There's like, I mean, we talked a little bit about Bo Gritz. He was a prominent Green Beret.
Great name.
Yeah, another great name. Yeah. Also, Randy Weaver was a Green Beret, although like his ideology is, I don't know, a little vague. Yeah. Okay. And so now we're going to talk about kind of the Green Berets' relationship to the fascist diaspora. And we're not going to get into it, but just know that also kind of gets us into like Contra territory and even like stuff in the Iranian Revolution and blah, 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 Honduran forces. These kinds of things all kind of follow from this relationship. So we're not going that far in this episode, but just to say that there is like an unbroken line between all of these developments that come back to some configuration of relationships between like fascists, the CIA or deep state in general, and the Intermarium movement, although you won't hear any more about Intermarium today. Mm-hmm. And I think the difference here also, which is important to point out, is that relationship to Intermarium, that is more about having like a relatively autonomous kind of Eastern European zone that is supposed to be more or less autonomous. Like as even like in contemporary discussions about Intermarium's relationship to NATO, people say it like this, like NATO is a step along the way to what we actually want. It's sort of a placeholder. The ultimate goal is to have like military autonomy in this sort of large region. So like despite its links, it is kind of an autonomous thing, kind of, and it has its own history. The Green Berets, though, are squarely, undeniably about the U.S. military. So I mentioned in Bloodstone that, in the episode about Bloodstone, that the labor service was becoming kind of an embarrassment, especially in Germany, where their group, the Young Germans, who you guys think is a very obvious Nazi name, but they thought it was pretty clever, got caught with a huge assassination list.
Were they called the Deutsche Jugend, for example?
Yes. Yeah, well, when you say it like that. So they had to hide their fascists somewhere after this, the scrutiny was on there. Ideally in the US. Of course, the problem is that even after Wisner managed to expand the number of people coming in through Bloodstone beyond its initial limit of whatever it was, 200 or something like that, they got it up to the thousands. The cutoff on immigration was still light years away from the other thousands of people that the Army, especially the PSYOPs division, wanted to normalize and bring into the US Army, including a chunk of that for their new project, which was the Special Forces, which, again, just to remind listeners, was initially thought of as a post-nuclear strike team that would be parachuted in on B-29s into irradiated hellscapes created by the U.S. government and shoot people and take the state. So, anyway, so the Army pressures Congress to pass the Lodge Act of 1950. And the deal of the Lodge Act was very simple. You get citizenship for military service. The program began with a limit of 2,500 people, but it quickly expanded to 12,000 people. Something like 5,000 of these people ended up applying to join the U.S. Special Forces, and of these, only 211 passed the initial screening. And this wasn't the number that the labor service guys had in mind. They wanted a lot more people out and through, but the screening was a bit tough, they thought. It was a little too harsh. So they decided to streamline it and get rid of a lot of the security checks and also ease up on the language requirements. And then they were able to bolster their numbers that way. So the fella that was there to receive new recruits was Colonel Aaron Bank. And coincidentally, or is it, Bank was the CIC guy in charge of the CIC guys in charge of Klaus Barbie. Bank was very familiar, consequently, with emigre paramilitary activity, and according to Simpson, the iconic uniform of the Green Berets was chosen specifically because it reflected the style of uniforms that these emigres had worn in their home countries. The guys now took on sort of the mission that had been given to Boris Pash, who we talked about in Bloodstone, his PB7 group, the Peanut Butter 7, under Operation Bloodstone, which, if you recall, was wet work, assassinations, that kind of thing. This meant that the Green Berets would be doing, and this is a quote from a Green Beret historian named Colonel Charles Simpson, a different Simpson, no relation, I don't think. This meant they would be doing raids and ambushes and guerrilla organization, as well as kidnap and assassination operations. So very much in that kind of Bloodstone vibe.
Right.
So to really get the Nazi nozzle flowing, though, Army, this is a position, an adjutant general, an adjutant. Okay.
Yeah.
Army adjutant general major general.
You fucked it up. Yeah.
I don't think I did. I think that's his fucking title. Let me just double check that.
No.
Wait. General.
I guess adjutant or something.
Adjutant? That's not, an adjutant sounds like somebody who's agitated, but this is an adjutant, someone who adjudicates.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Yeah, let me see. All right, so this is his actual title. Yes, this is correct. It sounds like a mistake, but it's not. Army Adjutant General Major General Edward Witzel.
Okay.
Army Adjutant General Major General. So I guess he's the Army Adjutant General, and he's also a Major General.
Okay.
Okay. Edward, yes. Okay, you got it. Good. So Eddie Witzel, in total secrecy, rules for the Army, because he can just do that. He's an adjutant. He can adjudicate. He adjudicates in secret that Nazis and collaborators are not, in fact, barred from Lodge Act recruitment, despite what the U.S. government says, although they would exclude any, quote, members of any totalitarian party, but of ex-members of fascist parties were free to come in. But we should also just clarify that at this point, the word totalitarian was also kind of a dog whistle, meaning Soviets.
Yeah,
It was something that had become very popular at this point.
So no Red Army people will be admitted.
No one currently in the Red Army will be allowed to join our anti-communist nuclear stormtrooper force.
Okay.
But fascists, it's okay. So it should be no surprise then that years later, when WAPO reporter Richard Harwood goes to write a story about the Green Berets in 1969, this is quite a bit later, he discovers a bunch of fasci folk and writes this. During those years, the Special Forces attracted recruits from Eastern Europe and old-line NCOs with single-minded views about fighting communism. This is a quote from an officer here. We had an awful lot of John Birch types then, says an officer with several years' experience in Special Forces. They thought like Joe McCarthy. I think that's John. I mean, like, of course. You know what I mean? Of course, the American fascist movement gets a lot of fuel from this.
Sorry, I like also the subtle, like, it attracted guys from Eastern Europe. Like, oh, these crazy East Europeans, they just wanted to come and fight communism instead of like, the CIA recruiting them and bringing them into the country.
Yes.
And, like, whatever.
Yeah.
Jumping through a million hoops to, like, make sure that their immigration status would be taken care of. And,
It's a happy marriage.
Yes.
It's a happy marriage. They both want each other. So back in the 50s, though, that was 67, that quote. But I mean, this shit gets started here. So back in the 50s, that same Army adjutant general, major general guy who said it was fine to hire Nazis now also took on the role of screening recruits, at least developing the system for their screening. And they had a very perfectly scientific and reasonable way of determining their fitness for special forces, which I would call blanket generalities based on nationality.
Okay.
So basically, even before they got permission to bring these people in, the Adjutant General's office drew up a chart that was there to evaluate the health and training and language skills and, quote, political reliability of each individual troop. The political reliability data they got made it onto another spreadsheet that divided up recruits into Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Yugoslav, Polish Jew, and non-Polish Jew, and gave each group a broad political reliability rating. So 100% signified the perfect recruit, or rather the perfect nationality from which to draw recruits. Minus 100% is misleading. It doesn't mean negative 100%. It means somewhat less than 100%, so not quite a perfect recruit, but still pretty good. The next category was 50%, which indicated a potentially problematic group. So Estonians, Lithuanians, and Latvians all got 100%. And I didn't mention this because of time, but Latvian fascism was by far the single largest beneficiary of Bloodstone in America.
Why are Hungarians not on the list?
That was a separate program somehow. There was a different relationship to the Hungarians.
There was. I remember there was there's something, I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I have read that there was a different thing for Hungarians specifically. And I think just generally like a more Mittel Europa one.
Oh, okay.
Because notice that like Slovaks aren't on there either, or like Czechs.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's because...
and Romanians, too. There was a whole different thing with Romanians, right?
Yeah, right. I think some of that has to do with Intermarium, actually. And I know that, for instance, there were Intermarium people speaking through, I don't remember if it was Radio Free Europe or Voice of America, but whichever State Department outlet, saying that the Americans would come to the aid of the 56 rebels there and like swoop in and save the day. And this was something that was being spread around there through these channels. And it's been partially blamed for some of the sort of like, let's say like, I don't know, eagerness with which a lot of people entered into the fight, kind of thinking that they would get saved and not, run over by tanks. Yeah.
I only asked about Hungarians because I was thinking about a joke about this test, like to determine how adequate are they a candidate. Like if you ask them something and they say name to them, you just give them 100%.
Yeah, an empty vessel. That's what they want. So so those guys, the Baltic guys got 100%. Ukrainians, Yugoslavs, and Poles all got the second tier, which was like reliable but not perfect. And surprise, surprise, both categories of Jews received the lowest rating as being potentially problematic politically. Russians, Italians, and quote, stateless recruits were also on the thing, but they all got question marks. They didn't get a rating.
So who's in the category with the Yugoslavs? Poles? Who?
No, yeah, Ukrainians, Yugoslavs, and Poles. So the Slavs got not quite perfect. The what do you call them? The Baltic types, they all got perfect scores, and the Jews got problematic scores. And then the Russians, Italians, and stateless recruits, they don't know.
Interesting.
They don't know what to make of them. Yeah. All right. So here's what happened to these guys. Again, I'm going to quote at length just to make it a bit easier on me. So the first known group of Lodge Act recruits arrived by a military aircraft at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey in October of 1951. Most of them were Ukrainians and Poles, but virtually every Eastern European nationality was represented. After an initial orientation at the camp, the Army shipped these recruits, like most of those who followed, to Fort Dix, New Jersey for 8 to 16 weeks of basic training. Others were sent directly to Special Army Intelligence Language Qualification Unit at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And following basic training, the recruits were dispersed across the United States and Europe. Substantial numbers were posted to the Defense Language School in Monterey, California, others to the Unique Armed Forces Demonstration Unit at Fort Monroe, Virginia, where defectors from Eastern Europe taught Red Army tactics to U.S. strike force team. According to declassified orders now found at the National Archives, about 25% of the enlistees were channeled into a variety of especially confidential assignments, including slots as atomic, chemical, and biological warfare specialists. Others became translators of captured secret documents and instructors for U.S. intelligence analysts. But back at Camp Kilmer, now, we found in 1954 from a sample, I forgot who did this, I think it was Internal Army Research. In 1954, a sample of 44 recent enlistees that all came as a group. 3 of them were ex-Wehrmacht, 1 was ex-Gestapo, 2 others were collaborators. And that's just like, all right, so those 44 enlistees were not necessarily special forces either. This might have also been regular army. It's kind of hard to understand exactly where everybody went. But essentially, it totals out to about 14% of enlistees had collaborator credentials or some kind of like fascist credential. So the Green Berets, though, and I think that that's pretty much what you like broadly Lodge Act. So most recruits were normal people for the Lodge Act. Something like 14% were probably fascists. The Special Forces, though, was a bit more concentrated for sure. And the Special Forces motto, which is De oppresso liber, seems to reflect what their actual self-image was, the image that they believed that they were, as far as the leadership anyway, which was a force of liberation from communism. You know, like nuking Russia and China and then dropping kind of Euro-style death squads into the radioactive hellscape would somehow, and this is a quote, prove that our American way of life is approaching the ideal desired by all mankind. And that's from this Army Recruitment Center. Yeah. Okay, so let's just kind of leave it there. The Green Berets would kind of evolve into like a training force as well that trained guerrillas in Iran, Nicaragua, Honduras. You will notice, like for instance, like the Iranian special forces, they still wear to this day, even though they were on the other side of the revolution, they continue to exist. They still wear the Green Beret uniforms that they used to have.
Interesting.
I don't know how they got out of that mess, but I think it had something to do with the war with Iraq, that they somehow proved their usefulness there. But they were initially there trained by U.S. Special Forces to be the Shah's personal strike team.
Well, I think also like a lot of people from the Shah's like intelligence service, what's it called, Savak or something like this, also started working for the new one after the revolution.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it seems like a lot of these guys made it to the other side there.
Yeah.
So I guess just as my closing remarks, thank you for being here. I just want to add just 2 quick kind of housekeeping things about the Bloodstone episode that didn't make it in, just 2 very small details. Firstly, so just some numbers which are interesting. The Justice Department, this would be in 1978, estimated that something like 10,000 war criminals were brought into the U.S. in this period in the 50s. and a random sampling of exposed war criminals, that is, those that were found or arrested or somehow brought to justice in some way. A random sampling of these by the General Accounting Office of the U.S. found that 20% of all the war criminals that were picked up in the U.S. actively worked for U.S. intelligence services, including the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings me to the second point that I wanted to make about the Bloodstone thing that we didn't talk about, and that is something that I believe that Boris actually alluded to in a previous episode, and that is that all these little exile groups in the U.S. allowed the CIA to legally spy inside of the U.S.
Yes.
And that comes specifically from a recommendation that was essentially made de facto law by both Truman and Eisenhower, and that is NSCID 13, or as the pros call it, NSCID 13.
And 14, I think, too. There were 2 of them, right?
13 was we allowed them to deal with domestic groups, and the other one was foreign, outside the U.S. borders, inside versus outside. Right. So the idea being something like, since these are governments in exile, blah, 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 essentially, like, we're still in our bounds. You know what I mean? Like, we're still working in the world. But that means that they could do pretty much whatever they wanted, as long as they did it through these organizations.
And those organizations, were allowed to have their own refugee relief organizations to bring as many people as they could or wanted into the U.S. without any particular oversight.
And that's also how you end up with a lot of these guys in Canada, because since these things were private, they were not officially part of the U.S. government. Like, these organizations were able to extend wherever they could, really.
Right.
So,
but that's intentional and very explicitly intentional, because these were, secret directives, intelligence directives at the time, which since have been declassified.
Exactly. Right.
I mean, the whole point was to keep keep the government's hands out of it, so that they could, be like, well, we didn't know that, Sobibor, fucking camp guard, is working in an auto factory in Cleveland. We have no idea.
Yeah. I had no idea he was involved in a coup. That's weird. Somebody should talk to his manager. Well, anyway, that's it. That's the end of the trilogy.
Well, cool.
Yeah. I don't know how long this NSCID 13 thing lasted. I don't know if it just went on indefinitely or if it ended in a few years. I really don't know. That'd be something that I'd like to.
My understanding, and I might be wrong about this, was that it was the directive itself had a period of time in which it was
they usually do
valid.
Yeah.
But that essentially those networks, or their ability to do that, kind of remained, as in these kind of refugee relief organizations, to the point that accepting anybody who accepting anti-communist refugees, regardless of who they are. Right?
Any old bastard, as long as he's anti-communist.
Right.
That's a quote.
And I think that remained. I think that I don't know for sure, but I'd be willing to bet that, intelligence involvement with those organizations continued. And in fact, I'm pretty sure they did, right? Because when you read a lot of these CIA reports from the 60s and 70s, they're still in touch with, all these Chetniks and whatever in Chicago and whatnot. But I don't know if that was still part of the same kind of directive or not. Or whether it's just it's a contact now. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I mean, at a certain point, you run out of fresh fascists because you get into the 60s and stuff. All the cool fascist governments already have Nazis you saved working in them. So
yeah.
Well, excellent. So in the future, we'll talk more about what some of these people who were smuggled through the Ratlines did after the war, and also the ones that came through maybe not exactly the Ratlines, but kind of similar programs as well.
Yeah, we've opened up. I mean, again, Bloodstone's a big deal here. That was a big entry point. But also, if anything, I hope that this kind of trilogy of episodes has shown that when the U.S. deep state wanted somebody, they got them.
For sure, yeah.
No matter what the law said, they were able to either make a secret directive, go up the chain, find a different interpretation, conveniently lose people's records, that kind of thing. And it didn't slow them down a bit.
Lovely stuff.
Like a knife through butter. Hot knife through butter. So this was all again a story of the Vatican secret plan to destroy Protestant America, and turn the faith into a Satanist deep state cabal.
Yeah.
And stay vigilant, folks.
Yes.
Stay vigilant.
All right, Monsignor Fritz. I love that when you read all the CIA reports, and they always refer to Draganovic as Monsignor Draganovic
or Monsignor Draganovic, which I found very difficult to do search tools with.
It's very hard in general because they have alternate spellings or misspellings and stuff in a lot of intelligence reports. All right, well, we'll catch y'all, I guess, next week, huh?
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know how to end that shit.
No. I mean, I'm just thinking. Yeah, so next week, I agreed to kind of go through all of our episodes from this arc so far, and try to piece together something of a semester recap before we go on to the next semester.
Yeah,
and we'll see.
Pop quiz, hot shot.
We talked about a lot of stuff.
We have,
and they're all connected, although maybe they don't seem so at first glance. So Fritz will attempt to connect it all.
Yeah, I bought 3 new chalkboards.
Yeah,
a whole box of new chalk. I'm ready to go.
Before we get into the crazy 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Shit.
Okay, bye.
All right.
See you then.
Later.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.